Well, it's something where if this were the 80s, it would work, right? Isn't that the idea? So
You should just leave it and see if anyone just like begins to ask one day, why is he wearing a life vest?
Look, Jacob, you don't need money. You don't need fame. You don't need no credit card to ride this train.
Wow.
All right.
That's true,
and it might
man.
just save your life. That's the power.
That's the power of love
that
Mike.
we're talking about.
Yeah,
exactly.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Voyage podcast, where we are going to be talking about, it's sort of our, it's a complimentary episode to our episode on fire that, Jacob loved doing so much in November. And so I thought a perfect, you could say not so much antithesis, but complement to the fire episode is we're going to be doing a water episode today. And so that's where it's going to kind of fit similar to our theme in November for sort of end of the world, but there's more to kind of this end of the world theme. But now instead of focusing on fire like we did, now it's going to be more on the water thing. What do you think about that, Jacob? Can you follow along with
I'm curious if we're going to like ultimately end this with like a Avatar: The Last Airbender, like penultimate episode. Is that how this is going to go?
I mean,
probably should. Have you not thought this through, Mike? I thought that's what we pay you for.
Yeah, something like that. So I guess when you said Avatar, I thought you were going to reference The Way of Water. And then you started going with The Last Airbender, and then it kind of threw me a little bit. And I actually haven't seen that the animated series, so I'm not.
I actually haven't.
I know what it's. I know that there's the Water Nation. I know that that's one of the 4 elements. But we're not going to go through. We're not going to do an Earth episode at least next week, and we're not going to do a wind episode at least next week. I think eventually, maybe around Pentecost. How does that sound? We'll do a wind episode.
Sounds about right is what that sounds like to me, Mike. Sounds
Jacob. It references a mighty wind before it references the tongues of flame, right?
Okay, yeah, that's true. That's true.
So first, let's just kind of get into some of the basics of this, just sort of where this comes up in storytelling, in mythology, but even in like ancient philosophy as well.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, like, do we like probably Waterworld with Kevin Costner is the first thing that comes to my mind.
That's ancient mythology. Yeah, we can get into that certainly. That will be, what? That can be our refreshing change of pace later on.
Yeah,
how's that sound?
We'll save that for later. Where does water show up in ancient mythology? Mike. I don't know. There's just so few. There's just so few references to water. I know,
it's like, how do you choose one? So one could almost say, and one has said, that everything is water, Jacob. Wow. Do you remember your intro, your philosophy 101 intro to philosophy?
True. Everything is water. And you could also say that you can never step into the same river twice.
Oh, that's a different one. But
was that not Thales? That was somebody else.
Oh, was it somebody else? I was thinking.
I don't know.
Thales is everything is water. I was going to joke because I was double checking on the pronunciation because obviously from an English standpoint, it looks like Thales. So I was going to say like the Thales fell from your eyes, but that wouldn't even work because it'd be Thales. So I would butcher the pronunciation too.
A good philosophy geek / theology geek like you should know that anytime you see some Greek name that has an ES on the end of it, it's always with an E's. Yeah, that's like easy, Mike.
Like Aristotle. Is that what you're saying? Is that what?
There's no ES on the end of Aristotle's.
Oh, that's just when he possesses something.
Yeah. You got me to say Aristotle's. Like, you're getting into my head, man.
That's good. See, Achilles, this is some good banter for sure.
Yeah, Pericles.
So yeah, we've got.
Pericles.
I mean, let's just go through our quote unquote pagan mythology first. I think the one that where this idea of everything being water, which so that's a reference to the pre-Socratic Thales, is you hear in a lot of Greek mythology that it's water that encircles the entire world or encircles the cosmos. And so you have this idea that even if you don't literally mean like everything, like that sand that you pick up is water, but it's that water is the organizing principle of everything else. In a sense, water is the thing that makes cosmos out of the chaos, you could say.
Well,
and
it,
so
well, and you know, is that the best way to phrase it? Because I would be tempted to
mhm.
refer back to like how the Bible says the Spirit of God hovered above the waters, right? In other words, it's like the primordial soup. You know, there's something
It's like
about
that's the
this.
chaos itself.
Yeah.
Like the
So
water is
and
the
that
chaos itself.
so yeah, the primordial soup, the waters of chaos of which order is brought forth from. You know, that doesn't mean the water becomes orderly. It just means that order comes from the chaos. Like the
Mhm.
chaos is more primordial or whatever.
It's the
Which
it's the foundation. Well, and this is telling, by the way, to say it that it's like it's the foundational chaos out of which order comes, which
mhm,
tells you that the order that you are seeing, if you're kind of have this ancient kind of Greek mindset, the order is the illusion, and then the deeper reality is the chaos. And that's really telling that in their, Oceanus, in Greek mythology is sort of that encircling water, that water that encircles the world. It's living water, which I think is important, and we'll kind of get into that as well. Because you even mentioned, stepping into the same river twice, so it's the river that is always moving, and that's what it was either Thales or Heraclitus that talked about how that's where everything is changed. That's the analogy
mhm.
that he was using to say that everything is,
You're probably
nothing is
right.
constant. Yeah,
Um,
like I said, it's,
that probably
a
was
lot of
Heraclitus,
those,
wasn't it?
pre-Socratics get mixed jumbled together too, so along with their pronunciations, but
You know, this idea that water is the kind of uh, essence of pre-existence, right? You know, in the ancient minds, they didn't have an idea of creation ex nihilo, right?
mhm.
They had the idea that there is just formlessness, and then there is formation, right? And so, and into the ancient mind, the idea of formlessness equates to nothingness. That
Mhm.
if it doesn't have a form, then it is nothing. You know, and take this toward Plato. Take, you know, his idea that like the eternal things are forms, right? And everything that we have is molded onto these forms. It's that's what's real. The form is real, and here in like temporality, the form is always changing, it's always malleable, it's always shape shifting, right? And so you know, I don't think that people quite make that connection when they understand like what Plato is saying is that what's real is what's formed, right? And because you don't have like eternal formation in this reality,
Mhm.
that's why he considers this reality less real, because it's more
Well
chaos. It's more chaos than it is like final form, so to speak,
well
right? Or finalized form.
And I even think, I mean, not that I don't want to turn this into a philosophy podcast. Actually, I do want to, but I know that I'm not supposed to. And obviously, when you mention Plato and the forms, he's somebody who's coming after Thales and Heraclitus. He's coming after the pre-Socratics, which is important because his idea of the forms, he's actually he's almost moving away from this like chaos is the more foundational thing by saying the forms are the realest thing there is. He's actually referring, like he's saying that order is a more fundamental reality, even
Right.
if and not that you have to accept that the Platonic realism of there are these literal forms that are in some space of the forms out there that we can't see, but he's at least getting closer to what we would both recognize in the Christian philosophical tradition, of the forms are like those are a more fundamental reality than the physical thing you can see in front of you, but not to the degree that kind of Plato went. So he was almost responding to the idea of the pre-Socratics where the real reality, the more fundamental reality is this water encircling chaos, or this
Sure.
out of which the illusion of cosmos or the illusion of order comes.
Well, and you know, this is something of a tangent. Have you ever heard that phrase "form follows function"? Right.
Sure.
That's like a common kind of. I I trace it back to architecture. I think. You know, it relates back to practical craft in the mid 20th century. I can't remember who said it. I can't remember. I know this is famous. I'm sorry, guys. I didn't study up on my mid 20th century architecture before this podcast, but or maybe it was like furniture making. I don't know. My brother has a really fancy chair that was created by someone who believed in form follows function. And when you sit in it, it's the most comfortable wooden chair you'll ever sit in, because he was like, form follows function. And then he like made the chair functional.
Was it Ron
Swanson?
Form. That sounds like a Ron Swanson thing.
No, all right. So anyway, the reason why I'm bringing up form follows function, though, is in the ancient mind, I think form and function were the same thing. So there's almost this arbitrary division between form and function when you say form follows function. I actually think that you are kind of abusing the idea of form when you make that distinction, at least according to the ancient mindset. I think that, the reason why, if something wasn't labeled formed, if something didn't belong to the idea of order or whatever, it's because it didn't have a function. And if something was considered quote unquote non-existent because it was part of like the chaos category of things, whether we're talking about the ocean or the wilderness or the desert or anything that wasn't considered real, quote unquote, because it didn't have a function. It didn't have a form and
Jacob,
function were the same thing to the ancient mind.
Keep trying to pull us out of the philosophy pool, and you keep pushing me back in.
The philosophy pool, see? Yeah.
What you're talking about, you're actually talking about Aristotle's four causes. You have the formal cause, but then you also have the final cause, and how the formal cause is meant to serve the final. So that's your form and function relationship. Is that the form of the thing, right? Everything that exists has these four causes. One of them material, the formal, the efficient, and the final. And the first three, the material, the formal, and the efficient, are serving the final, which is, like you said, that's the function of the thing. And so that's the relationship that is inherent in all things that exist, whether it's being, expressed explicitly by Plato, Aristotle, and all that stuff. So
well, there you go, kids.
No,
there's your philosophy of philosophy form and chaos.
Philosophy pool. So we have
the kiddie pool of philosophy.
So Oceanus, hey, that's the new podcast we're gonna have to release in a couple weeks. Jumping into the kiddie pool. Yeah,
wading into the kiddie pool.
So Oceanus is that Titan from Greek mythology, but we got some others from Greek mythology. I mean, the nymphs, the naiads, and the sprites, like those are like water spirits. So those are like smaller sort of versions in a sense, but they have this kind of chaotic element to them, right? I mean, they kind of are the fairies of the water.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or the spirits of the water. There's another, if we're talking, this isn't so much about the water as it is a thing in the water, but there's of course the Atlantis story.
All right, wait.
So
let's not move past the naiads quite yet. Okay. So here's my thoughts on the naiads. I think that, and this is kind of like fairy too. I've talked about this in podcasts in the past, but I'm not sure which episodes they were at this point anymore. Where I don't think that some of the stuff is necessarily theologically sound, right? Mm-hmm. But I do think that these forces of nature, all right, let me put it like this. I think that there's what I do think is theologically sound, though I could be corrected on this because I am not a fancy schmancy theologian. That I do believe that at least the ancients believed, and ancient Christians believed, maybe not all of them, but at least some of them, that the angelic powers were actually in charge of and controlling, these forces of nature, that the water itself is appropriately personified by an angelic presence that is in control of that facet of creation, that the principalities and powers that control this world are, there's the fallen kind, right? And those are the bad guys that St. Paul is referring to when he talks about those. But I think that the unfallen angels, when you get into those like hierarchy of angels, the 9 choirs of angels, I think that some of those are referencing the kind of divine council from the Old Testament that is in charge of organizing and ordering creation, and that things like water and wetness and the way that water is controlled and things like that, how it operates, is these aren't just like physics. They're not impersonal. They're actually the activity of personified beings that are following the orders or the will of God the Father, right? And so I think what happens in pagan mythology is that you have a remembrance of that. But I also think that like they turn into stories and they turn into untrue stories and things like that, right? And so fairies and things, they become this kind of echo of, I think, something that is actually true, that there actually are personal powers, kind of like
Yeah.
constantly controlling things all around us and things like that. And so I think the question then becomes is like, well, is there any veracity to the idea behind some of these fairy stories or these like naiad stories where, potentially is it true that some of the fallen angels, right? And this is me just completely hypothesizing at this point, so this is just, you can throw this away if you want. But like, are there evil angels that are still kind of like water angels, quote unquote, right?
Yeah.
Or like
Yeah.
air angels or something like that, And is the type of evil that we see in the world, if it's perpetuated by some kind of like whatever untimely water death or something like that, does that in some kind of metaphysical way fall at the feet of the evil that has kind of corrupted this created order as such, to include
Well,
like water kills us now? Or yeah, I don't know, I'm just
no,
playing
that's
around in the sandbox, folks.
well,
In
when
the
they
kiddie
talk
pool,
about,
if you will.
when they talk about certain like bodies of water being treacherous, right? Or they talk about certain bodies and obviously dangerous and or powerful, right? I mean, we
Mhm.
have literally tried to harness the power of water when it comes to like waves and that sort of thing. So, I mean, it shouldn't be that big of a leap when, like you said, the ancient people personified everything. So that had to have come from somewhere, right?
Oh,
Even if you want to look at it purely from like a biological standpoint or an evolutionary standpoint, it still was something that was ingrained in rational creatures.
sure.
And so we would just see that as, you and I, and not only us, but many would just see that as, well, that only tells us that we are, more magical than we realize, or that we've forgotten or whatever.
Or
And
certainly the created order is.
and there's something about the fact that, if it was just an isolated incident, like this one culture happened to do it, then you could dismiss it and just be like, oh, well, that was just a bunch of weirdos. But like the fact that this is ubiquitous to every ancient culture, and the fact that even in like modern culture, we still do a version of this. We just maybe, we sort of like, uh, sanitize it a little bit, or even like, or just give like more, clinical names to it or whatever. But we still do this sort of like personification of, just like any of these natural forces that we kind of come to experience.
Yeah.
But, so yeah, we've got like you said, the Greek story of the nymphs, naiads, the Poseidon as well. In Norse mythology, Njord was the male personification of the sea or of water. And I think it's, well, here's another, like, I'll butcher the pronunciation, but Ron, I think, is would be the female personification,
Okay.
which I think is significant that you have two. The fact that we have flood stories in, I mentioned Atlantis briefly. Epic of Gilgamesh is probably another classic example.
Sure, certainly. Okay, yeah. No, you like the when it comes to these personifications, or before we actually get into like flood stories and things like that,
Yeah.
you forgot a biggie, and that's Tiamat,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
The Babylonian personification of salt water. Because here's the
Okay.
thing, like, and this is a big difference. Living water is related to rivers, like flowing water, obviously, right? Like the living refers to it moving, but specifically, it's like fresh water. You know what I mean? Like, I guess that might not entirely be true. I do think that moving water is more important to the idea of living water than anything else. But there is an idea between like salt water and fresh water being two different types of water, right? And like the good water is the, the not salt water, right? Whereas the salt water, will drive you crazy if you drink it. And it's also like the chaos water that surrounds the world or whatever. And Tiamat was the salt water, the primordial salt water goddess lady.
It was a contrast of life and death, right? So not just that the water itself was living, but that it gave life. But then, like you said, we've been talking so much about cosmos coming out of chaos or order coming out of chaos. And so it's telling that, there is this idea that drinking salt water would make you crazy. It's like you lose that cosmos or that rational faculty.
Yeah, the logos
from this,
right? You lose your logos,
So you lose that the order as well. So that's another kind of contrast between the living water and the water of death, or the salt versus fresh
we can
water.
make that connection back to like demonic entities again too, because this idea of like weeping and gnashing of teeth in the Gospels, where Jesus is casting out demons and things like that, that's a reference to madness specifically, right? It's not just like, oh, I'm so upset, I'm weeping and gnashing. It's like you're literally losing your humanity. You're reverting back to kind of an animalistic gnashing, and you're losing your image of God, right? If you're losing your humanity. And so it's the same thing as saying you're losing your logos. And obviously logos is a specifically Greek word from like Greek tradition that is a reference to shows up. It's in the philosophy of Greece before it ever makes its way to the Gospels. The Christians take the understanding of logos and say, yes, I recognize Jesus in this.
Let's personify it. Hey, what do you think about that? Let's, we'll personify logos. We'll personify wisdom. It's like, that's kind of what, because in Proverbs you have personified wisdom, and then you have in the Gospel of John personified logos recognized in Jesus.
Absolutely.
So speaking of this whole idea of like water, in a sense, it's like you said, it's dry. It's sort of like, connected with death, connected with madness. We have some flood stories. So we've got Epic of Gilgamesh. We've got Atlantis.
A few. I think there's a few flood stories out there, Mike.
There's some
one or two
significant ones. Hey, Jacob.
Yes, Mike. What is it?
Hey, doesn't Voyage have a book about Jonah going to Atlantis? Isn't there a flood story that Voyage is responsible for?
Now that you mention it, it's probably my favorite Atlantis story of all time. I'm telling you, Mike, this is the best interpretation of Atlantis you are ever going to see in any medium across all the ages. Yes.
That's right. Yeah.
You should get 17 copies and give it to all of your give it to all of your nieces and nephews this Christmas.
That's like everybody in your parish.
Yes, it is.
Sorry, that was a low blow.
We keep it small because
it's intimate. You like to say it's intimate.
That's how you know we're good. Yep. All in the family.
It's the remnant, the faithful remnant.
Yep, we're the faithful few. Yep, the few, the proud, the Orthodox.
So anyway, not that we have to like go over the just the basics of the story. I think the significance when we're talking about flood stories is obviously the contrast that we'll see in the biblical flood narrative, which again, I think we can assume a somewhat level of familiarity. I don't know how much we have to kind of go into those, but you basically have the idea that, in one sense, I like what you were saying about it's the idea of losing your image of God, losing that logos, because what we see in the biblical flood is that in a sense it's already happened, and then the water coming is just almost like a manifestation of that, where it's like the world has already lost its logos. The world had already gone insane in the sense of turning away from God in sin. And so now the water is just become, in a sense, like the earth reflecting what we had already done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I also think that the fact that the flood is a return, like, so here's the sequence of events in Genesis, right? You have the world. The Spirit of God hovers across the waters. He brings earth out of the waters. That's organization. Ultimately, he plants the garden with humanity in it. That is where God and man meets. It's on top of the mountain.
And that has rivers, that has living waters.
The living water comes out of it. It's not salt water. It's river water. And there, so it's different from the primordial waters. You know what I mean? It's this God-bearing water, holy water, if you will. And then what happens though is when humanity leaves the garden and populates the rest of the earth, that the order that's come out of the chaos, they turn it back into chaos. And when the waters come back, it's everything dissolves. It's almost like the waters are not just the result of humanity falling back into chaos. It is humanity falling back into chaos.
It's a reflection of what's already happened in this. It's almost like it's like, because if God gives
it's inevitable. It's
the
inevitable
role of stewardship.
Yeah.
If God gives humanity the role of stewardship, then creation is going to follow humanity's lead. And so the flood story, the leading up to the flood, or the flood itself, is reflecting that in, you could say, a symbolic way or a narrative way. That's not me saying the flood is symbolic. Like I said, there's just too much evidence from all world history.
Honestly, like, it's crazy. This is the one thing I think is downright neat, is like, just, there was clearly some kind of major catastrophic flood, right? I mean, I guess there's no way to really know how extensive it was scientifically, blah, 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 whatever you want to say or whatever. But there was clearly some kind of reality shaping flood.
There's something
that occurred.
Innate memory of humanity.
Yeah, it's everywhere. I mean, for funsies, I just Googled, go to Wikipedia, my favorite website, and just like,
especially when it comes to Dracula.
Especially when it comes to Dracula. They really nailed it on that one. The list of flood myths, and there's just, it's the entire world, man. The entire world. So, but I think that what's really interesting for me when it comes to this flood myth stuff is, how it reflects humanity's understanding of itself, because these floods always are dynamic changing realities for like the human race as such. If you look at the Greek flood, it's they all basically serve the same purpose that the flood serves in the story of Noah, like complete with just like a few remaining survivors of some kind. Those numbers change a little bit, but they have to kind of restart humanity, and I think that kind of speaks to, like, we'll say, recorded history. It's almost like recorded history, living memory, begins with humanity after the flood, right? And the stories that we have prior to the flood, whether if you're talking about like the Garden of Eden stories, these are like really highly mythic tales, right? And there's a few more highly mythic tales post flood, like the Tower of Babel and things like that. But it's really, really quickly.
That's another ubiquitous sort of myth too, is you have this sort of like, something has to explain the spreading out and the differences of people. So that's another one of those like almost primordial or prehistorical.
Well, and it is, but it also isn't, in the sense that, like, so the Tower of Babel, at least there's details. At least there's like a story of like empire building affiliated with this idea of like, this is what humanity decided to do really early on, right? Post Noah. All we really know about like pre-Noah is that the angels came down and like taught humanity like all kinds of stuff. And then like they became so evil that like the flood occurred, right? Like, so it's like, we don't even know what that looked like, except for the fact that it was just nasty. Just like really, really nasty, right?
Well, and because it's a high place, it has something to do with worship, Jacob, is what you were going to say too, right?
With Tower of Babel?
We should do an episode on high places and their connection to stories and worship, shouldn't we?
Man, wouldn't that be a novel idea?
That's a retroactive plug for a past episode.
Past
go back
episode.
And look at Go Tell It on the Mountain, I think is the title. Since I remember,
wasn't that a clever title?
Somebody came up with something. That's for sure.
I know. No one's ever used that in a title about mountains before.
I get the first crack at the titles, and then if I can't come up with something, Jacob has to step in and he's like, "Oh, we'll just throw this in there." So,
but even the Atlantis story, there's something fascinating about the idea that
it was because of their folly too, which is significant, right? I mean, that's part of the Atlantis.
That tends to be part of it. Yeah,
it's like hubris, man's fatal flaw, kind of thing.
You have this like Uber society, right? And you can affiliate that with, especially from a pagan perspective. They're going to say that all the technology that they received from the Nephilim was a good thing. Like, oh, look at all this technology we have, all this ways of controlling the world around us, and all this way of manipulating matter and things like that, manipulating our lives and stuff. Thank you, angelic beings that came down and gave us these things. And,
Prometheus.
Yeah, thanks, Prometheus. Yeah, exactly. And, Atlantis is this reflection of a society who thinks that's like, oh, yeah, look at how cool that all was, right? But then it leads to the flood, the hubris leads to the flood. So again, it's what Lord of Spirits podcast, where I always name dropping, at least I am, would call this Atlantis is kind of like pagan propaganda, right? But all the stories are like that. All of these different.
Well, it kind of reminds me of, I've mentioned this before, and I think it's worth like the idea that even like quote unquote pagan or unbaptized cultures, unbaptized humanity still gets the idea of original sin and concupiscence, even if they don't want to call it that. It's like they get the effect of original sin in the sense that they know that, something is off about our desires. Something is off about like what we are seeking as human beings, that it's not the ideal or the perfection. But yet not necessarily recognizing where that comes from, right? In the terms of nobody wants to acknowledge original sin, but everybody or a lot of people, even quote unquote Hollywood culture, will get concupiscence. Like they get concupiscence even if they don't want to say that it's because of original sin. And I think it kind of goes back to even something like these flood stories where it's like we can kind of see, through a glass darkly that something is off, but we don't quite have, the name for it, or we don't quite have the description of it, at least as it's been revealed through the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? So we don't have it, revealed by God. But
you want to, that just put into my head everything you just said.
Sure.
And it started with the whole through the glass darkly thing. Remember in Lord of the Rings when Galadriel has that like mirror that allows you to like see stuff? But it's like this old fashioned. Yeah, that one. It's one of those old fashioned ones though, where you like put the water into it, and then what you're looking at is the reflection of yourself in the water, right?
Yeah.
And so, you were just talking about how they don't have the means of like seeing things, right?
Yeah.
So, but like, there's an example in Lord of the Rings.
Checking off the bingo card.
Yeah, checking off the box.
I was actually gonna. See, you made a reference before I did. I was going to reference the Fall of Numenor because that's Tolkien's.
Oh, it's a flood myth.
That's his Atlantis flood story. Which actually that can kind of move us into our more kind of pop culture or modern myth examples. We
get to talk about Waterworld now.
Okay, I'll give you 5 minutes. 5 minutes. That's too long. No,
that'd be way too long.
So we've got some. So, I mean, actually, when I first brought this up, you were like, oh, well, I just saw The Shape of Water, which you kind of said is like, well, it kind of works. I mean, it's got water in the title. It's not like, or no, not Shape of Water, The Way of Water.
Way of Water, yeah. Shape of Water. Dude, honestly, I saw that you wanted to talk about Shape of Water, and I can talk about Shape of Water.
Maybe I should hold off on that one.
Yeah, that might be a Halloween episode for next year where I just rant about this movie.
Add it to the list.
Yeah, let me tell you something. I like Guillermo del Toro's stuff. He's always a really interesting filmmaker. I recently talked about how cool Pacific Rim was and how you refused to watch it because you're a loser. And
I stand by that.
Oh, dude, you should check it out.
I'll watch
he's got all kinds of good stuff. I like Guillermo del Toro, but Shape of Water is a weird movie. That
was it won Pan's Labyrinth? He did Pan's
Picture.
Labyrinth too, right?
He did, yeah, way back in the day. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to say it won Best Picture. Yeah.
Yeah, it did. And I don't know how much you want to talk about that movie in this episode because we shouldn't. Because I'll just go off the rails about this movie. But
that's a nice teaser for all the way till next year. That is a drop.
Many months from now. Yeah. That's a goofy movie, man. That's a goofy movie, and it's
I'll add
funny.
That to the show notes.
If you want to, here's how it applies to today's episode. If you want to know what a culture looks like that is ready to be like flooded away, the kind of like culture that produces things that like are worthy of just being washed away from this earth. You get The Shape of Water getting nominated and winning the Best Picture movie. It's the most absurd commentary on the state of modern pop culture. One of those weird self-owns that occasionally you see, like this weird demonic world we live in, just kind of like make a choice and be like, that's the choice you went with, huh? That's where you're going with that, huh? Okay. So
that's, you know what, honestly, that is a pretty good elevator pitch. Like, I'm pretty intrigued now. So I'll have to go see if it's on a free streaming service. So what about, we did talk a little bit about Avatar during our tree series.
Yeah.
Our exciting tree series about 6 months ago or so.
Is that how you're dictating these episodes, Mike? You just wait for James Cameron to come out with a new Avatar movie, and then whatever his theme is, it's like when we did trees. Yeah. If that was true, it would be like 10 years before we did another.
We did wasn't one of our first like episodes. I was going to say like we've talked a little bit about Terminator in our AI episode, but not really that much. So, talk about another end of the world scenario. So anyway, Avatar: Way of Water.
I actually watched this one. Yeah. I watched it. I watched it a little bit ago. I was like, you know what? Fine, I'll bite the bullet. I'll check it out. And I will say that it is got a really, really entertaining, well told second half. It's a long movie, right? And so the first half is fine. It's not revolutionary. Tell me if you've heard this one.
It's catching you up because you haven't watched, because the first one you saw 10 years ago. So,
well, yeah, kind of. They cover that in like a little epilogue within the first like 10 minutes or whatever. But ultimately, like the bad guys come back. They destroy the home of where the characters live. I can't remember their names. Sully. Sully is the main character, right? He's got a family now with Cat Lady. But they go and they get their home gets destroyed, and so they have to travel to the Water Tribe, and they have to learn the ways of the Water people. And so the first half of the movie is them like getting their feng shui on with like the water stuff.
It's Dances with Wolves, but
it's like they managed to get another Dances with Wolves story out of the Dances with Wolves Avatar franchise.
Everybody wanted a sequel, and now they're like, Kevin Costner's too old, so we have to, reboot it.
It's true.
In space. Dances with Space Wolves.
Dances with Space Cats. Blue Smurf cats. But the second half of that movie, though, super intense, awesome action sequences, really, really good storytelling, really, really cinematic storytelling, I guess I should say.
They're again kind of highlighting the water being life, sort of. In a sense, it's surrounding them. So it kind of goes back to our water being the surrounding reality to this tribe, at least. But it also has that life-giving quality, right? But it does. It's not so much fresh water as it is like, it kind of looks.
They are, it's seawater. It's okay. Sometimes it just don't work. But like, especially if you're talking about like Polynesian islands and things like that, I do think that any type of civilization that's not landlocked, that is dependent upon fishing, for example, for its livelihood or whatever, they're going to have a different kind of relationship to the saltwater ocean that classical Mediterranean or European, I guess, or Levant mythology is. I don't know. It's kind of interesting because the Mediterranean was such a big life giver. But I suppose the argument would go that the life is still something that comes from the ocean, right? But it's not the ocean itself, whereas examples in modern storytelling, you have the Way of Water, in which they're demonstrating this kind of like symbiotic relationship with the reef, the sea and stuff like that, they live in it and stuff like that. Another one that comes to mind is also like Moana, that Disney flick that came out about a decade ago now.
That's got some cool like kind of symbolism in terms of, I mean,
Yeah, it's like super feminist, but I like it. Okay, I'm on the record. I'll say it. All right. This is a movie that really, really hates men, but it does it with some really cool songs and some really great visuals. And so,
I mean,
I'm
how
buttered
we're just a
up.
sucker for that musical theater. That's some
That's,
there, so.
That's right. They knew how to butter me up to take the medicine. Like. But yeah, we could one of these days we'll do a Moana episode and I'll rant.
I was gonna say,
how,
I feel like that was a mix of metaphors. I was like, is that a spoonful of sugar that helped? I didn't know where the.
Well, that is
the medicine.
It's bad medicine.
Okay.
It's the medicine they think is medicine, but it's not actually medicine.
No, but they buttered you up to take the medicine. I was like, isn't it a spoonful of sugar?
I know. Listen, I can't.
That's another musical. That's Mary Poppins. That's
true. But Moana, the water actually has like a life force to it in Moana, and it's beneficent. It's helpful, right? Which in and of itself is kind of an inversion of classical symbolism and things like that, because that movie is super inversion of everything.
Well, but yeah, I mean, even the whole because it's obviously that the island is the one bringing death, whereas it's in the water, but it's ocean water that they find life, or they have to seek out life. But
the ocean water is there to help her out.
Yeah, it kind of has this personified spiritual element, so that's where you kind of get that. I mean, so no.
But here's what it's that was all kind of a distraction. Ultimately, Polynesian cultures or island cultures, they do have a different flavor going on for their mythology and things like that. I think that they have a much more friendly relationship to the ocean than a lot of other mythologies have. But I also think that fundamentally, the ocean is it's still kind of a chaos monster, even in that lore. It's something that gets traversed. It's something that gives them food, but also gives them like monsoons, right? Like so, it's still chaotic, right?
Yeah. So we went through our classical or our ancient mythology examples of water. We went through some modern examples, brushed over them a little bit quickly, but that's fine.
Yeah, like Waterworld. We didn't even talk about it.
Oh gosh. All right. I mean, yeah. Well, there you have, I mean, how present of a reality, how engulfing of a reality do you have with water there? I mean, that's literally the entire world, right? You have this kind of post-apocalyptic.
Well, it's and so here's how we're gonna make this time.
Another Costner movie. Another Kevin Costner
movie.
It is.
It's another Kevin Costner movie. We're gonna do an episode on just like the films of Kevin Costner one of these days.
No, we won't.
Think about it. Think about it. You got Dances with Wolves. You got Field of Dreams. You got Waterworld. You got Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. We could do some bomb episodes off of Kevin Costner's filmography.
I mean, you mean ironically, hate watching them? Is that what you're thinking?
What? Yeah, right. I used to love Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. When I was a kid, I watched that movie all the time. That's a great movie. It's got Alan Rickman as the sheriff of Nottingham, and his mom is a witch. That's a sick movie, friends. You guys should go check it out. Kevin Costner is supposed to be a British lord, and he just sounds like Kevin Costner, who occasionally puts on a British accent. He was a weird choice for that movie, but people, they loved Kevin Costner in the early 90s.
They still do.
And what movie changed that? No. Well, no, this is much later. Yellowstone is much later.
I'm saying people still
Waterworld killed his career. So I think there's something really fitting about the idea that Kevin Costner is this rising star, who is super successful, one of the most popular actors of his generation. And then Waterworld happens, right? And if that's not symbolic, I don't know what is, Mike.
Yeah.
So, and hey, that's a story about how global warming causes everything to flood. And then it's basically
audiences just weren't ready for it then. But if that had come out now, it'd have been like, we'd have eaten that up for sure. That would have been like number one.
He's a merman. Like he evolves into having like little fish gills, and so like he's a liminal person, Mike. He's a master of both worlds.
Very good. Exactly.
Yes.
Call back to Joseph Campbell. So he starts off as a master of both worlds, but the real world he has to master is the world of his heart, I think is what that's true. That's the tagline.
I like that. I like that. That's really nice. You know what?
Is that enough? No.
No, we're good. We're good on Waterworld. But it is a good reference for this idea that the flood is man's dissolution, right? So if according to the whole global warming thing, especially in Waterworld the movie, it gets so hot that everything melts, and that's because of man's corruption, right? Like all the ozone stuff is corrupt.
No, it's another
man.
I mean, it's like every other flood story. It is supposed to be sort of us pointing the finger back at ourselves. I mean, in one way or another. So
well, and while we're on this type of like film tangent about floods, did you ever see the movie Noah with Russell Crowe?
I never did, actually. It was one of those where it's like, oh, that looks interesting. I know I should, but I just
that's kind of weird.
Kind of lost interest. I don't know.
I mean, people like listen, if you're into like intertestamental,
Book
mythology,
of Enoch stuff. I mean,
Book of Enoch stuff. It's very much based on like Book of Enoch stuff. Yeah, it is not your Sunday school flood story. That's for sure. But it's cool. I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting.
Honestly, I think I would probably enjoy, like you said, almost like getting the apocryphal kind of story element into the story of the flood.
The Nephilim are there. Like there's all kinds of the stuff we talk about in this podcast is in that movie. I'm not going to say it's like the best movie I've ever seen. It's a little too long, and it's a little too long ultimately. But it is a really, really, really good depiction of pre-flood humanity and just how corrupt it is. Like, there's nothing cool about how the human beings are behaving in the time of the flood. Like, it's like gross, it's like apocalypto stuff.
Well, because that's sometimes
like, it's like, I don't want to live there.
You get the sense of like almost like there's a sympathetic bent towards like
the Atlantis
thing.
The Atlantis thing.
And that's, you see that a lot in kind of modern, like almost caricatures of the Old Testament or of the flood story, where it's like, oh, like everybody was just so bad. And it's like, that's actually more believable than you might think. But that's
let's not underestimate.
That's not the most unbelievable part of the Noah story. But
truth.
So actually, that kind of is a good sort of tie-in, because I wanted to go through significant examples of water in the Bible. You talked about creation, how it's the Holy Spirit that hovers over the waters at creation, kind of bringing that order out of the chaos that the water was representing. You have the waters of purification at the flood, where, in a sense, as we've already sort of talked about, the water is almost like making obvious what was already happening. What was already covering the earth was sin. That was the real problem. And the water was just sort of showing how chaotic, or what the chaos actually, how we sort of experience it. Then we have the waters of deliverance at the Red Sea, right? These are all the kind of the big three examples from a Christian typological standpoint when you start looking at the early church and baptism, right? Baptism, those are like the three big Old Testament stories. Not that there aren't other stories, but those are like always because those are the ones that like St. Peter talks about the flood in 1st or 2nd Peter, I can't remember. He makes reference to baptism and the flood. St. Paul makes reference to passing through the water in one of his letters as well. So we have them directly referenced in the New Testament as types for baptism later on with the coming of Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you it's interesting that it's such a recurring motif, right? And there's a few different motifs, like fire is another motif that's frequently used for all kinds of things in the Bible. But water is definitely, right? I mean, maybe the most.
Yeah,
it's really prevalent. But these really big stories obviously, like the idea that in Genesis everything comes from the water, right, is brought forth out of the water, kind of thing. And then through, like you said, in Exodus, they have to go through the Red Sea, right? These types of ideas that, like, salvation, you have to go through the chaos, like you have to go through the
and
the
and
weird
same thing with the
space.
flood, right? They go through the flood and they emerge from it in the same way that the Israelites emerge from the waters of the Red Sea. And that's what leads them. I mean, first it is through the trial of the desert, but ultimately it's out of slavery, out of death, and into this new life.
Yeah, well, they're not quite out of the wilderness yet, when they get through the Red Sea, so
It's kind of like
baptism is the
out of the
beginning.
frying pan and into the fire. It's sort of like out of the
There you
sea and
go.
into the desert. So
Yeah,
out of the
exactly,
Red
though.
Sea and into the desert sort of scenario.
That's clearly gonna be like a type of the Christian life, Your baptism's just the starting line, right? It's
Yeah.
just the beginning, So you go through the waters, but then you have to wander the desert for 40 years, That's your life, right? And then you get to the promised land, and that's the new heaven and the new earth ultimately. But the um oh shoot, this is where I was gonna go. The icon, if you look at an icon of Christ's baptism,
Yeah.
when there's a couple really interesting things about it. One is oftentimes this varies. I've seen both, but sometimes he's in the water, like kind of like up to his waist. But oftentimes, maybe even more often, he is standing on a rock in the middle of the water, right? I think I would reason that is a reference to, like, the earth coming forth from the water. Like, it's a deep, deep
100% is,
symbolism.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
100%. Yeah.
So
Same
where
thing with,
Christ
like,
goes, the dry land appears, kind of thing. Just like for
well,
the Israelites to the Red Sea, but just like for, like, creation itself coming
and
forth out of the
it's
waters.
the ark resting on Mount Ararat as well.
Hey,
So it's
Mike,
like,
what do we call the central area where everyone stands in our churches? My Sunday school class knows this, Mike. I
okay, you're
drilled it
catching
into
me off
them.
guard. I was central
The
area where
nave. The
everyone stands.
nave.
Oh, okay. I was first thinking like the narthex, but yeah, the nave, like
Yeah,
navy,
narthex
like
be the
naval.
front porch, the entrance.
That's the entryway. Yep.
Yeah.
So
The nave, yeah,
the
and
nave,
that
like
literally,
naval.
that's referencing like naval ships, not like your belly button. But
Well, that too, because it's the central part of your body. It's both. It's both.
That
But
makes
anyway.
sense. That makes sense. I did always kind of wonder why the naval was called the naval, but I guess
There
that
you
makes
go.
sense now. Yeah. But it's the ship, it's the ark, right? So the church is the ark, and the world outside the church is the flood. So there you go, kids. There's your Sunday school lesson.
Yeah.
Straight out of Jacob's Sunday school class.
Out of Jacob's Architecture 101 class.
Hey, there you
So
go.
we then have, I mean, so you mentioned the baptism of Jesus. There's actually the Gospel of John has a bunch of. Go ahead.
Wait. And the icon, the other cool thing about those icons is like you'll see all kinds of like sea monsters in the river.
Oh, sure.
So
Yeah.
and so like there's actual, like, chaos creatures and things like that. So,
Mm.
and I mean, in other words, this symbolism is not some kind of like weird thing that people made up in the 20th century,
Yeah.
Like, this is ancient people, when they were creating this art, when they were creating this symbolism, when they were creating this church tradition,
Yeah.
they were very aware of what's water symbolized,
Oh, for sure. This, I mean, we're in, not that we're like just recognizing this now, but it's one of those
Well, we
things
kind
where
of
it's
have
like,
to remember it.
mhm.
I sure wasn't being taught this stuff in Sunday school growing up, like I wasn't being taught this stuff in pop culture, or I didn't learn about any of this until adulthood,
Yeah.
So,
And it's, and in one sense, it's one of those joys of always getting to kind of invest and re-engage in your faith and things like that too. Is like, yeah, I sometimes will say to people, even if you did learn it, like even if you went to, Catholic school, Christian school, or you went to, faith formation, whatever that looked like, you probably weren't as disposed anyway. Like, even if you had the best theology teacher in the world, you're not going to
sure.
necessarily be as disposed as a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old, or even as an 18-year-old for some of these things.
Right.
So we have, you mentioned Jesus, the baptism of Jesus. Gospel of John has tons of references, not just the Gospel of John, but you have the Gospel of John, the letters of John, and the book of Revelation are all, you'll say, flooded with water references.
Nice.
Like that. Flooded with water references. That's where we get the whole like out of me will flow rivers of living water.
Rivers
That's
of
from
living
his
water.
Jesus's talk with the Samaritan woman at the well. We have the huge image in Revelation of the rivers flowing in heaven, and kind of the fruit from the tree of life. And so that, again, it's sort of a back to Eden kind of experience. So the last question that I wanted to kind of wrap this up with is, why does, and I know we've sort of answered around this question, but we've gone through a lot of the stories. Why does a spirituality of water actually make sense? And not just the chaos part of it. Not just the fact that water, is what gives us physical life or biological life, but what are some of the like properties of water, the aspects of water where a spirituality of water makes sense? I mean, I've got some.
Is that like? Well, I'm just like, is it a rhetorical question or is
no? If you've got some stuff, I mean,
okay.
We can mess around with this too. If you don't like how this exchange is going, but
no,
I would clean this up in post.
I would say that the idea of water being redeemed, right, being transformed, I think that there's always been a relationship between like a differentiation between like the salt water, the chaos water, and like the river water, right? The living water stuff. I think that's true, but I also think that Christ transfigures the human understanding of that into an idea of water being redemptive. And that it becomes a symbol of transference of salvation, of going through, reaching back into like the Moses story type stuff. But it's the type of water that we are constituted with, right?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I suppose we are kind of salt water though, aren't we? We're womp womp. But certainly it's the stuff we drink that allows us to keep being alive and things like that. I think that it's transfigurative. I think that this becomes another example of Christ's redemption, and it takes on a sacramental reality.
Well, it's one of those funny things where when people talk about like, what diet or what helped you get so healthy, and they're like, oh, well, I was just drinking water, and it's like, well, what nutrients were in water? It actually isn't about the nutrients in the water. It's water becomes the thing by which all the nutrients that you are already receiving or that you have in you can sort of work together. So it becomes that thing that even if there's quote unquote nothing in it, which I'm not saying like that's literally true. I'm saying like there's no vitamin A in a jug of water. There's no vitamin C in a jug of water. But it's the idea that it's what allows everything that's in you or that you're receiving from food and from the sun and all that to sort of work together. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's like a I guess like a solvent, right? Isn't that
a universal solvent?
Yes. Yeah. I saw. So, well, it's like, like you always, water is the medium in which you can like mix things together, So like,
So this actually ties into the two things the two like physical properties of water, which I was so I got to tell you, I took my kids to the aquarium a couple of weeks ago, Jacob, and taking your kids to the museum, to the aquarium, it's really more for the parent who didn't pay attention as a kid than it is for the actual kids. Because I'm looking at this stuff and I was like, oh, this is interesting. I had some interesting ideas, which I know I'm saving this all right for the end. But there are these two elements of water that it's pretty standard. They have that water is cohesive and that it's adhesive. Okay, so in adhesion,
like if you lick a stamp, it sticks to the envelope.
Well, we'll see. But the adhesion. So adhesion is referring to what you were talking about, the universal solvent, where it will kind of wear away. Right, that's where water erosion kind of works. Is because of this idea of adhesion, it will pull stuff off. Right, it'll stick to and pull stuff off. That's why it can strip stuff away. Well, what do we talk about with baptism? Is that it's through the water of baptism that our sins are stripped or pulled away because the water, quote unquote, sticks to it and pulls it off. Right. And so it's something that comes right from the adhesive properties, but then it also has cohesion because what else does water do is water sticks together. And they even show you the V shape of the molecule. I was like, oh, that's kind of triangular, sort of Trinitarian when you have the water molecule of the H, O, and O. And that's why it sticks together. But what's the other aspect of baptism, Jacob? Not only does it wash away or, strip away the sin, but it also binds us
to Christ,
to the body of Christ. It binds us to Christ. It's cohesive to us and our soul to the body of Christ, or to Christ and his church. And so I was like, isn't that so fitting that we have, again, this is science, folks, right? Cohesion and adhesion is this, like, it's part of water already. And so it naturally kind of fits into this sort of spirituality of water that we'll see in all of our flood stories, like we saw, or we see in baptism as well later on.
Sure. Well, it does kind of go back to the tree episode, when one of the things that we talked about was, like, trees are just like a really, really important facet of, like, human existence. We take them for granted, but, like, everything is built out of them. We live in homes that are made out of the wood that came from trees and things like that. How much more so water? Like, water is literally the thing that you die after, like, 2 days if you don't have any of it, right?
Yeah.
Whatever, 3 days or however long it is.
However
long, whatever. You really need some water, folks. After this episode,
water.
Drink. Yeah, don't drink salt water. Go hydrate after this.
Wow.
If anything,
the more you know.
The more you know.
That's drink water. That's
the moral of this episode. Yep.
That's why we have to have morals now. Exactly.
Yeah. We're not useful unless we have some kind of moral lesson to deliver, Mike. Isn't that
basically? That's like all parables. Go? All parables, the only value is in how it's propaganda, Christian propaganda.
That's right. So
is that how we're gonna end? I was only gonna press
well, you're supposed to wrap us up, right? Go like and subscribe, and
do you want me to
whatever
say that,
the kids say?
Just cut this part out.
No, this part's staying. This ain't getting cut.
Oh my gosh, don't do that to me. Thank you, Jacob, for indulging me for this refreshing conversation about water and its role in, mythology and stories, but also in theology and spirituality. And if you guys enjoyed this conversation and others, maybe even our fire conversation, even more than Jacob did, we ask you to, like, subscribe to the show, leave a 5-star rating, positive review, share this with, other people you think might be interested. When it comes to just, these sorts of things that we see in our stories all around us, or in all the, the stories that we hear about, we learn about, and how it kind of connects to just that element of our faith and of reality. So thank you guys.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.